Welcome back to Python by example. We are at session number 5 in the series. And in this session, we want to have a look at the concept of loops. So what is a loop? A loop is a particular command or construct that allows us to repeat a block of code multiple times. And the key thing here is that we are doing something over and over for a specific number of times. So that is a loop. The other thing to bear in mind is that we have different types of loop. So we have a loop that is known as a definite loop. And in this type of loop, we know exactly how many times the loop will execute. In other words, the number of times that we are going to process the loop is known beforehand. After we have processed the loop that number of times, then the loop will terminate. We also have something known as an indefinite loop. And in this case, we do not know the number of times that the loop will actually execute. So that's the distinction between the definite loop and the indefinite loop. With the definite loop, we know how many times the loop will execute. With the indefinite loop, the number of times the loop will execute is not known. However, we still know, or we still are assured, that the loop will stop in both cases. And then we have the type of loops that we do not want to create at this stage, and this is an infinite loop. And an infinite loop is one that actually never ends. Now, you might be wondering, why would a loop not end? And this leads us to an important concept about loops that we should always remember. Loops will run whenever the condition is true. So we are going to set up a condition for our loops. And as long as the condition is true, then the loop will continue to execute. However, the loops will stop whenever the condition becomes false. So if we have a loop that never ends, then what this tells us is that the condition that is supposed to allow the loop to stop was not constructed. And that's the reason why the loop will never end. In the Python ecosystem, we have two keywords that we are going to be using to set up our loops. One of them is the for, and the other one is the while. So we have the for, and we also have the while. Typically, the for is used for the definite loops when we know how many times the loop should execute. And the while is typically used with the indefinite loop when we do not know the number of times that the loop will execute before it ends. Let's now quickly demonstrate these loops in action. The quickest way to set up the for loop is to use the for keyword followed by a variable. I'm just calling the variable I in this case. In range, and we set a range value. Let's do a print so that we can see the value in I each time that we go through this particular loop. And for this loop, we only have one statement that is associated with the loop. Key point, whenever we want to indicate the the statements that are associated with the loop, then we have to indent them. And we indent them right beneath the loop header. So the loop header here says, for I in range 5. And all the statements which are indented under it will then form a part of the code block that we want to repeat multiple times. Let's quickly execute this command so that we can see how many times it will actually execute. So if you have a look at the screen in terms of our output, you will see that we have executed 5 times. We have executed for 0. We have executed for 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you count the number of times we actually see an output being displayed, then that will give you the number 5, which indicates that this loop actually looped 5 times. Note, the start in this case is 0. And if you set up the range command such that it only has one value, then that value indicates where you are going to end. Note, however, that we do not print that value. So we print the start value, 0. So we print the start value, 0. And the ending value is 4. Between 0 to 4, we end up with 5 values. The value 5 that we see here in this case is going to be the value that tells the loop when to end. So whenever the value 5 is reached, then this loop will actually end. You are advised to always indicate the start and the end, because this makes for better programming. So in this case, the start is 0. We put a comma. The end is 5. And what this says is that we're going to be looping from 0 to 4. And we are going to end whenever we reach the value 5. So just to say that one more time, we are going to loop whenever the value I falls within the range 0 to 4. And we are going to end whenever the value I becomes 5. So once the value is between 0 and 4, then we are going to go to line 13, and we are going to actually do the print statement there. However, once the value becomes 5, then we no longer enter the loop. So in order to clearly illustrate what is happening and when we end the loop, let's go below the loop and let's put a print statement that clearly tells us. Well, let's say loop terminated. So whenever we reach line 16 and we see the message loop terminated, then that tells us that the loop has ended because we have obtained that value that will cause the loop to end. So we are going to re-execute the command. We have put in the start and we have put in the end. So that's the start, that's the end. And we want to test this to see if we get back the same thing. And yes, we do. We get back the values 0 to 4, which are the values which allow us to enter the loop and to process the loop. And once the value becomes 5, then at that point, the loop was terminated. This is what we call the definite loop because we know exactly how many times this loop will loop. It loops 5 times, as demonstrated by the values which are printed. Now we can determine where the loop condition begins. For example, I could go from 1, and because 5 is here, then it means that this loop will actually print 4 times because we will run it from 1 to 4. Remember, 5 is the value that causes the loop to stop. So let's execute that and see. Note, we end up with this loop executing 4 times, as demonstrated by the values which are printed 1 to 4. And once again, we terminate whenever the value 5 was entered. Let's do one more quick example, just playing around with the ranges. And then I'll do a practical example. So let's say we have 1, 13. Then what does this tell us? It tells us that whenever the value 13 is obtained, then the loop will end. It tells us also that we are starting this loop at the value 1. So therefore, the last value that allows us to enter the loop is actually going to be 12. In other words, this loop will process values from 1 to 12, and it ends whenever the value 13 is entered. Now, I did say that we are going to do something of practical value. And in this case, we want to display the mathematical timetable. We know that the mathematical timetable, usually when you look on the back of the books, it ranges from 1 to 12. So 5 times 1, and then it goes up to 5 times 12. So we are going to use the concept of a loop to actually generate the mathematical timetable for a user based on a number that they would have entered. So let us prompt the user. So we are prompting the user to enter a number. So num is equal to int, then we have input, and then we prompt the user, enter a number. We are then going to fix up the print statement so that we can generate the mathematical timetable. So this is going to be num times I is equal to num star I. So that's the output that we want to print. For example, we want to print 5 times 1 equal 5, 5 times 2 equal 10, and so on. So this print statement, the way it is formatted, will actually give us that kind of display on the screen. So let's execute. So we enter the number 5, and let's have a look at our output. So we are generating the mathematical timetable for 5, running from the values 1 to 12. And if you look in that middle piece, or in that middle column, you are seeing the value of I being displayed. And the value of I here runs from 1 to 12. And this generates our mathematical timetable for us. We also see right at the end that it indicates that our loop has terminated. So whenever the value 13 is obtained, then we jump out of the loop. We exit the loop. So that's what we have so far. This is a practical example of what you can do whenever you are making use of the loop construct. So we have just examined the concept of a definite loop using the range command. And there's just one more thing that I just want to demonstrate quickly. We can determine how much we add to I each time we go through the loop. So let me add 2 each time. So it means that the starting value of I is 1. And then the next value of I would be 3. And then the value of that after that would be 5. So let's test that out. So let's enter the number, same 5. And if you look at the middle numbers, I want you to note that we have 1, then 3. So 1 plus 2 is 3. 3 plus 2 is 5. 5 plus 2 is 7. 7 plus 2 is 9. And 9 plus 2 is 11. So each time we go through the loop, we are incrementing the loop by 2. If it is that we do not have this number at the end, then it is understood that we are incrementing the loop by 1. So that's the default incrementation value. Let me just do another example. Let's increment the loop by 5. So 1 plus 5, that's going to be 6. And then 6 plus 5, that becomes 11. Let's test that out. Enter the number 5. I'm just looking at this middle piece again. You see that what I said is happening. We have 1, then 6, then 11. The other kind of loop that we want to look at quickly is the while loop. And as we have discussed before, the while loop is an indefinite loop. So unlike the for, we won't know exactly how many times the loop is going to loop. And just to quickly backtrack, since we have the output here on the screen, when we did the for loop, we started at 1, going up to 13, which is the ending value, and we increment by 5. Then note that the loop actually looped 3 times. And that's why we are seeing 3 values here. So we are seeing 3 values there, which meant that the loop executed 3 times. We only entered the loop 3 times, just to put it another way for clarity. So let's now have a look at the while. So here we have an example where we obtain a score from the user, and we say while the score is not equal to 0, we want to print the score, and then we obtain another score from the user. So let's duplicate that over in our compiler. I'm still going to have the loop terminated message so that we know exactly when the loop terminates. So we had score is equal to int input, and we tell the user to enter a score. We then set up our while structure. So while score is not equal to 0, please note the colon at the end of the condition. We're now incrementing so that we can place the statements which are associated with the loop in their proper order. And I think we had done some print. So we do a print first, print the value of score, and then we allow the user to update the score. So let's do the print. So doing a formatted print. So score is And let's print score. And right below that, we are now going to say score is equal to, and we allow the user to input another score. So let's say enter new score. All right, let's have a look at what this does. So we are going to execute. So let's enter score. Let's enter 5. So we print the 5. Let's enter 10. So we print the 10. Let's enter 6. So we print the 6. So far, we have processed the values 3 times. 1 for 5, 1 for 10, and 1 for 6. If we now enter 0, then note that the loop now terminates. So we entered 3 values before the loop terminated. Let's clear. Let's re-execute. Let's enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 0. In this case, it should be clear to see that we entered the loop 8 times. So the loop was entered 8 times. At the point that we entered the value 0, then at that point, the loop actually terminated. So we have just demonstrated here that with this type of loop, the number of times the loop is processed is not known beforehand. In fact, it is determined by the user. As long as the user keeps on entering values, which ensure that the loop criteria, the condition is true, then the loop will continue to execute. The loop only stops executing whenever the user enters a value that causes the condition to become false. Another key thing to note is that inside of the loop, there must be some way of updating the variable that controls the loop. The variable that controls the loop here is actually score, because it is score that is being used on the conditional line. Therefore, if score is not updated, then we are going to end up with an infinite loop. So let's have a look at that. Clearing the output, and I'm going to comment out line 15, because line 15 is where the user is able to enter a new score and therefore update the value that is placed inside of the score variable. So let's run this with line 15 gone. And let's enter a value 1. And note, we now have an infinite loop. This print statement that you're seeing keeps on executing over and over and over and over. If you look at the button here, notice that it is still running. It is still executing. So we are keep on printing line 14 over and over and over. And the reason for that is because when we enter a score of 1, then it means that the condition is true, because 1 is not equal to 0. Because 1 is not equal to 0, then it means that that condition is true. And there's nowhere within the body of the code, within the code block, that is linked to the condition, linked to the while, that allows us to update the value of score so that we can exit the loop. And these are the kind of loops that we do not want to be creating in this particular module. So we do not want to create infinite loops. So we need to ensure that somewhere in the body of the loop, whenever we are using the while, we allow for the user to be able to enter some input that will stop the loop, or we account for some condition that will occur that will cause the loop to stop. A common example would be, for example, we are reading from a file, and when we reach the end of the file, then we want to stop the loop. So that's a common example that we'll typically see an indefinite loop being used. For all intents and purposes, though, we have now covered the whole concept of loops. We have looked at the for loop, which we are using as a definite loop, and we have looked at the while loop, which we are using as the indefinite loop. We will be doing some examples, some problem statements that will allow us to make use of the concept of loops in conjunction with the other commands that we have learned before, such as how do we create variables? How do we access inputs? How do we apply our operators? How do we make use of our if statements, the various if statements, like the single if, the double if, and the multiple if? And we will be combining all of these concepts into solving problems based on the nature of the problems. So it is very important that you keep up to date with the various sessions. As mentioned, this is session 5. You would have had 4 sessions before this, and each of the sessions keep building on the next session as we progress in the series. So it's important to keep up to date with all of them. So that's it for this session, and see you in session 6. Thank you.